The first sound anyone heard was the heartbeat of a dragon. Slow, heavy, ancient. It echoed through the crimson hall, a cavern carved deep into the heart of Mount Varkalon. The chamber was so large that clouds of warm mist floated beneath the ceiling like ghostly storms. Rivers of glowing magma crawled through carved channels in the floor, casting red light across pillars etched with runes older than any kingdom alive. And at the center of it all lay the Dragon Prince. Prince Arkhavel, heir to the greatest dragon bloodline in the world. He had not moved in 300 years. His massive body lay curled atop a throne of molten crystal. Scales the color of dark crimson steel shimmered faintly with heat. His wings were folded along his sides like ancient banners that had not been unfurled in centuries. Each slow breath sent ripples of smoke curling from his nostrils. But his golden eyes never opened. The Dragon Kingdom had tried everything. The greatest dragon mags gathered beneath the mountain. They chanted spells powerful enough to shake the clouds. Runes were carved into the stone around him. Ancient relics were brought from distant lands. Sacred flames were lit. Priests prayed. Sorcerers bled magic into the air. Yet the prince never woke. Not once. Not even a twitch. At first the kingdom had been patient. After all, dragons sometimes slept for decades. But decades turned into centuries. And fear slowly crept into the kingdom. Without their prince, the future felt uncertain. The Dragon Queen ruled with strength, but enemies watched from distant mountains and dark forests. They knew the truth. The kingdom's greatest weapon slept. Rumors spread across the land. Some whispered that the prince had been cursed. Others believed a forgotten enemy had poisoned his mind. And some dragons spoke of a darker possibility. That the prince simply refused to wake. 300 years passed. 300 years of failure. 300 years of spells echoing uselessly through the Crimson Hall. Then one day, a human arrived. Not a hero. Not a knight. Not even a wizard. Just a boy. His name was Ethan Carter, and he smelled strongly of hay. He arrived at the mountain gates with a wagon of supplies and a letter from a traveling merchant guild. The kingdom often hired humans for small jobs. Humans were stubborn creatures who were surprisingly good at dangerous work. The guards barely looked at him. "You're the new stable boy," one dragon guard grunted. Ethan nodded nervously. "Yes, sir." "Good," the guard said. "Try not to get eaten." Ethan laughed awkwardly. The guard didn't. The dragon stables sat far below the royal palace, carved into warm volcanic tunnels where the younger dragons lived. It was loud, hot, and smelled strongly of ash, smoke, and roasted meat. Ethan's job was simple. Clean the stables. Feed the dragons. Try not to die. The first dragon he met nearly burned his eyebrows off. A young bronze hatchling named Brim lunged forward the moment Ethan entered the stall. The dragon snapped his jaws and puffed a small burst of flame. Most stable workers screamed when that happened. Ethan just stared at the dragon. "Oh, relax," he muttered. The dragon blinked. Ethan tossed a slab of meat onto the stone floor. "You're not scary," he said while grabbing a shovel. "You're just dramatic." Brim tilted his head. Then he ate the meat. Something strange began happening after that. The young dragons started following Ethan around. They didn't snap at him. They didn't breathe fire at him. They watched him. Sometimes they even listened. One afternoon, Ethan caught two hatchlings fighting over food. Instead of running for help, he simply clapped his hands. "Hey!" Both dragons froze. "You two are acting like idiots." The dragons blinked at him. "Share the meat or nobody gets it." For a moment the stable went quiet. Then the hatchlings slowly backed away from each other. Across the stable tunnels, an older dragon caretaker watched the scene with wide eyes. He whispered to another worker. "Did you see that?" The other caretaker nodded slowly. They listened to him. Word began spreading through the mountain. The strange human stable boy who talked to dragons like stubborn farm animals. And somehow, the dragons seemed to like him. Days passed. Then weeks. Eventually the rumors reached the royal court. And finally, they reached the ears of the Dragon Queen herself. The queen was ancient. Her silver scales had darkened with age, and her wings stretched wider than the palace gates. She had ruled wisely for centuries, but even she could not solve the mystery of her sleeping son. When she heard the story of the human boy, she frowned. "Dragons listen to him?" she asked. A royal attendant bowed. "Yes, your majesty." The queen stared toward the distant crimson hall where her son still slept. For a long moment she said nothing. Then she gave a quiet command. "Bring me the boy." Far below the palace, Ethan Carter was busy shoveling ash when two armored dragon guards suddenly appeared in the stable tunnel. The dragons around him quickly scattered. The guards looked down at the dusty human. "You," one of them said. Ethan blinked. "Me? The queen wishes to see you." Ethan froze. The shovel slipped from his hands and clattered against the stone floor. "Wait," he said nervously. "Did one of the dragons complain about me?" Ethan Carter had never been inside the royal palace. Stable workers rarely went above the lower tunnels. Their world was made of volcanic stone corridors, dragon stalls, and the constant smell of smoke and meat. The palace above was different. Quiet. Grand. Terrifying. As the two armored dragon guards escorted him upward through spiraling tunnels, Ethan tried not to stare at everything around him. The walls glowed faintly with ancient runes. Massive pillars carved with dragon history held up the cavern ceiling. Every few steps they passed nobles, soldiers, or servants who paused to look at the dusty human stable boy walking between royal guards. Some whispered. Some looked confused. Others simply frowned. Ethan swallowed nervously. Am I in trouble?" he asked. Neither guard answered. That did not make him feel better. They continued climbing until the air grew warmer and the tunnels opened into a massive chamber Ethan had never seen before. The royal court of the Dragon Kingdom. The chamber was enormous. Lava rivers flowed through carved channels in the floor, casting deep red light across towering statues of ancient dragon rulers. Dozens of dragons filled the hall. Some in full dragon form. Others in their humanoid shapes. Golden armor gleamed. Wings shifted restlessly. Eyes followed the small human walking nervously through the chamber. Ethan felt about the size of a mouse. At the far end of the hall stood a raised platform carved from black volcanic stone. And upon it sat the Dragon Queen. Even in her humanoid form, she was intimidating. Tall. Silver-haired. Eyes glowing faintly like molten gold. Behind her rested her true dragon form, an enormous silver dragon coiled behind the throne like a living mountain. Ethan nearly tripped when he saw it. The guard stopped before the throne and pushed him gently forward. The queen studied him silently. Ethan scratched the back of his head. Hi. Several nobles gasped. One court mage looked horrified. But the queen simply watched him with calm curiosity. "So," she said slowly, "you are the human who talks to dragons." Ethan blinked. I mostly feed them." Soft murmurs spread through the court. One elderly dragon mage stepped forward, his robes glowing with magical runes. "Your Majesty," he said sharply, "this is ridiculous. Dragons obey bloodlines and ancient magic, not stable boys." The queen raised one clawed finger. The mage immediately fell silent. Her golden eyes returned to Ethan. "The caretakers say the young dragons listen to you." Ethan shrugged. "They're not that hard to deal with." The entire court went quiet. Not hard? These were creatures capable of burning cities to ash. And this human spoke about them like stubborn farm animals. The queen leaned slightly forward. "Tell me, human," she said. "What do you say to them?" Ethan thought for a moment. "Well, depends." "On what?" "On whether they are being dumb." Several nobles looked offended. One dragon snorted smoke in amusement. Ethan continued nervously. "Mostly I just tell them to stop fighting, eat their food, and quit acting dramatic." The silence in the hall became almost painful. The court mags looked as though someone had just insulted their entire profession. But the queen did not look angry. In fact, she looked thoughtful. Slowly, she stood from the throne. Her wings shifted slightly behind her, casting long shadows across the chamber. "For 300 years, she said quietly, "the greatest magic users in the kingdom have tried to wake my son." The court lowered their heads. Spells. Rituals. Ancient relics. Her voice echoed through the hall. None of them worked. The queen turned her gaze toward the distant tunnels leading deeper into the mountain. Toward the Crimson Hall. Where the Dragon Prince slept. Then she looked back at Ethan. "They say dragons listen to you." Ethan shifted awkwardly. Sometimes." The queen gave a simple command. "Come with me." The entire court froze. The royal mag stepped forward immediately. "Your Majesty," one protested. "The prince is protected by ancient wards. We cannot simply allow a human." The queen turned her head slightly. The mage stopped speaking instantly. No one argued with the Dragon Queen. Not twice. She began walking toward the deep tunnel leading to the Crimson Hall. The guards motioned for Ethan to follow. He hesitated. "Wait," he whispered to the guard beside him. "Where are we going?" The guard looked down at him with an unreadable expression. "To see the prince." Ethan blinked. "The sleeping one?" "Yes." Ethan swallowed. The stories of the sleeping dragon prince were famous even in human villages. A dragon so powerful that the entire kingdom had tried, and failed, to wake him for centuries. And somehow, Ethan Carter was now walking toward him. The deeper tunnels grew darker. Hotter. The air vibrated faintly with ancient magic. Soon the corridor opened into a vast cavern. The Crimson Hall. Ethan stopped walking. His jaw slowly dropped. Because at the center of the cavern, curled atop a mountain of glowing crystal, lay the largest dragon he had ever seen in his life. The Dragon Prince. And he was still asleep. The Crimson Hall was larger than anything Ethan Carter had ever seen. The cavern ceiling disappeared into darkness hundreds of feet above. Massive stone pillars carved with ancient dragon runes rose from the ground like the bones of a forgotten world. Rivers of glowing magma flowed through deep channels, casting a dim red light across the chamber. And in the center of it all, lay the Dragon Prince. Ethan stopped walking. Completely. His brain simply refused to process what he was seeing. He had worked around dragons for weeks now. Hatchlings, young dragons, even a few older guardians in the outer tunnels. But this creature. This was something else entirely. The Dragon Prince Arkhavel was enormous. His body coiled across the cavern floor like a sleeping mountain. Crimson scales as large as shields reflected the lava light, glowing faintly like smoldering metal. His folded wings stretched wider than a castle wall, their edges resting against crystal pillars that had been carefully carved to support them. Long black horns curved backward from his head like ancient spears. And his chest rose and fell slowly with each deep breath. The sound echoed through the hall like distant thunder. He was alive. Very much alive. Just asleep. Ethan whispered quietly. "Wow." Behind him, the royal court slowly entered the cavern. The Dragon Queen stepped forward first. Dozens of guards and mags followed, but they all kept a respectful distance from the massive dragon resting at the center of the hall. No one approached too closely. Except Ethan. The queen stopped several yards away from the prince's head. For a moment, she simply looked at her son. 300 years. 3 centuries of silence. Her voice, when she spoke, was calm. "This is my son." Ethan nodded slowly. "Yeah. I figured." Several nobles looked irritated by the boy's casual tone, but no one dared interrupt. One of the elder mags stepped forward again. His robes shimmered with ancient spell work. "Your Majesty," he said quietly, "we must remember the danger. The prince's magic is immense. If the human startles him." The queen raised one hand. The mage fell silent. Her golden eyes turned toward Ethan. "You have spoken to young dragons." Ethan nodded. "Yeah. Have you ever spoken to one of this size?" Ethan looked back at the enormous sleeping dragon. "Not exactly." A faint ripple of nervous laughter moved through the court. The queen stepped slightly aside. "Go." The word echoed softly through the cavern. Ethan blinked. "Go, where?" The queen nodded toward the prince. "Try." The entire court held its breath. Ethan stared at the dragon. Then he stared at the queen. Then back at the dragon again. "You want me to wake him?" "Yes." The boy scratched the back of his neck nervously. "Okay, but, just to be clear." He pointed at the dragon. "If he wakes up angry, that's kinda on you guys." Several guards shifted uneasily. The mags whispered protective spells under their breath. But the queen said nothing. She simply waited. Ethan sighed. "Well, all right then." Slowly, carefully, he began walking across the cavern floor. Each step echoed loudly in the massive chamber. The closer he got, the larger the dragon seemed. Up close, Arkhavel's head alone was the size of a small house. His massive jaw rested against a ridge of crystal. Warm air flowed from his nostrils with every deep breath. Ethan stopped beside the dragon's head. He looked up. And up. And up. "That's a big lizard," he muttered. Across the hall, several nobles nearly fainted. The stable boy glanced back at the court. Dozens of dragons were watching him. Waiting. Expecting something incredible. Some magical breakthrough. Some forgotten spell. Ethan looked back at the dragon. Then he shrugged. "Well, here goes nothing." He stepped closer. Carefully. Until he stood right beside the dragon's massive ear. The prince didn't move. His breathing remained slow and steady. The court held its breath. The cavern fell completely silent. Ethan leaned forward slightly and whispered 3 simple words. Get up, lazy. For a moment, nothing happened. The Crimson Hall remained completely silent. Ethan straightened slowly and glanced back toward the royal court. Several dragon mags already wore smug expressions. One of them quietly muttered, "Ridiculous." Another shook his head. 3 centuries of ancient magic, he whispered to a fellow scholar. And they thought a human stable boy could succeed. Ethan scratched the back of his head awkwardly. Well, I tried. He turned slightly, preparing to walk away. Then the ground trembled. At first it was small. A faint vibration beneath Ethan's boots. Then it grew stronger. A deep rumble rolled through the cavern like distant thunder. Dust fell from the ceiling. The lava rivers rippled. Across the hall, every dragon suddenly stiffened. One of the guards whispered in shock. Did you feel that? Then something moved. Slowly. Massively. The dragon prince's tail twitched. A long ripple traveled through his enormous body. Crystal beneath his claws cracked with a sharp sound. The entire court froze. The mags stared in disbelief. For 300 years the prince had not moved. Not once. And now, his wings shifted. The sound alone was like stone grinding against stone. The air pressure in the cavern changed. Ethan turned around just in time to see something terrifying. One of the prince's enormous golden eyes slowly opened. The pupil narrowed immediately as light filled it. The eye turned and locked directly onto Ethan. Across the hall, panic exploded. Guards, someone shouted. Shields up, yelled a court mage. Several dragons shifted into battle stance. Magic circles flared to life across the floor. After all, an ancient dragon waking suddenly after 3 centuries could be extremely dangerous. But the prince ignored everyone. His massive gaze remained fixed on the small human standing beside his head. Ethan raised one hand awkwardly. Hi. The dragon blinked once. Then again. His chest expanded as he took a deep breath. When he spoke, his voice rolled through the cavern like thunder echoing inside a mountain. Took you long enough. The entire hall went silent. Ethan blinked. What? The dragon prince slowly lifted his enormous head. The movement alone sent powerful gusts of wind across the chamber. Loose scrolls and cloaks fluttered wildly. His wings stretched slightly. Crystal beneath him shattered with a series of loud cracks. Several mags nearly fell over. But the prince looked relaxed. Not angry. Not confused. Just mildly annoyed. His golden eyes studied Ethan. Then he spoke again. I've been waiting. Ethan frowned. For what? The dragon snorted softly. A cloud of warm smoke rolled from his nostrils. For someone to stop chanting spells at me. The court mags froze. Arkhavel slowly shifted his massive body, stretching his wings like someone waking from a long nap. You have no idea, the prince continued, how irritating 300 years of magical chanting is. Several nobles looked horrified. One mage whispered weakly, Your Highness, we were trying to wake you. Yes, the prince replied. That was very obvious. His enormous head turned slightly toward the court. And extremely loud. Then his gaze returned to Ethan. You, the prince said. Ethan pointed at himself. Me? Yes. The dragon lowered his massive head slightly so his golden eye was level with the human. You talk normally. Ethan shrugged. Yeah. Everyone else whispers spells, the prince said. They treat me like a sacred relic. He snorted again. Very boring. Across the hall, the dragon queen stared at her son in stunned silence. After 300 years. After endless rituals and magic. The thing that woke him was a stable boy complaining at him. The prince stretched one enormous wing. The movement sent another tremor through the cavern. Then he looked back at Ethan. You have food? He asked casually. Ethan blinked. What? I am extremely hungry, the dragon said. 300 years is a very long nap. For several long seconds. No one in the Crimson Hall moved. The court stood frozen. The mags stared in stunned silence. And the dragon queen looked at her son as if she were seeing him for the first time in centuries. Prince Arkhavel slowly stretched his wings. The movement alone shook the cavern. Crystal pillars groaned, and dust drifted from the ceiling like falling snow. He yawned. A massive, fiery yawn. A wave of heat rolled across the hall, forcing several guards to step back. Food, the prince repeated, his voice rumbling like distant thunder. Ethan crossed his arms. You're serious? Yes. You just woke up after 300 years, Ethan said, and the first thing you want is lunch. The dragon blinked slowly. Yes. Ethan sighed. Well, that's fair. Across the hall, the Dragon Queen finally stepped forward. Her silver scales shimmered faintly as she approached her son. Every step echoed through the cavern. Arkhavel, she said quietly. The dragon turned his enormous head toward her. Hello, mother. The queen's golden eyes narrowed slightly. You have been asleep for 3 centuries. The prince shrugged his massive shoulders. I know. You ignored every spell. Yes. You ignored every ritual. Yes. The queen's voice became sharper. Entire generations of mags tried to wake you. I heard them. A stunned murmur rippled through the court. The queen's wings shifted slightly behind her. You heard them? The prince nodded lazily. Every chant. Every spell. Every sacred ceremony. He snorted smoke. Very dramatic. The court mags looked personally offended. The queen stared at her son. You mean to tell me? Her voice dropped into a dangerous calm. You were awake this entire time? The prince blinked again. Well, not awake, but aware enough. The queen's tail flicked against the stone floor. And you simply chose not to wake. Arkhavel lowered his massive head slightly. Yes. The cavern fell silent. Even the lava rivers seemed quieter. Finally the queen asked the question everyone in the kingdom had wondered for centuries. Why? The prince thought for a moment. Then he answered honestly. Because royal life is exhausting. Several nobles gasped. Arkhavel continued calmly. Every day it was the same. Ceremonies. Politics. Endless council meetings. People bowing and whispering. He sighed deeply. So I decided to take a nap. Across the hall, a noble dragon nearly fainted. A 300-year nap, someone whispered. The prince nodded. Yes. The queen's eyes narrowed. You abandoned your kingdom. I didn't abandon it, Arkhavel said calmly. I trusted you to handle things. The queen folded her wings slowly. That is not the point. Arkhavel looked around the hall. Dozens of dragons stared back at him with shock, disbelief, and confusion. Then his golden gaze returned to Ethan. But none of that matters now. Ethan blinked. Why? Because you woke me. The prince lowered his head until his massive eye was level with the human again. You talked to me like a normal creature. Not a god. Not a relic. Not a sacred symbol. Ethan shrugged. You looked like a lazy dragon taking a nap. Arkhavel grinned. A massive dragon grin filled with rows of enormous teeth. Exactly. He slowly lifted his body from the crystal throne. The sound echoed through the cavern like a mountain moving. For the first time in 300 years, the dragon prince stood. His wings stretched wide, filling the entire hall. The power radiating from him made the air feel heavy. Every dragon in the room lowered their head instinctively. The kingdom's greatest warrior had returned. But Arkhavel simply looked amused. He turned toward the court. I suppose I should start ruling again. Several nobles nodded eagerly. Yes, your highness. The prince paused. Then he added one more sentence. But first. He looked back at Ethan. I need someone to make sure I don't oversleep again. The court blinked in confusion. The dragon prince pointed one enormous claw toward the human stable boy. This one. Ethan pointed at himself again. Me? Yes. The prince looked at the queen. Mother, I have a decree. The queen folded her wings. Speak. Arkhavel grinned again. From this day forward, Ethan Carter will serve as royal dragon keeper. The court erupted into shocked whispers. A human? In a royal position? But the prince continued. His first duty. He leaned down toward Ethan again. Is waking me up every morning. Ethan stared at the enormous dragon. How exactly do I do that? The prince chuckled. Same way you did today. Ethan sighed. Then he looked up at the massive dragon prince and said loudly. Get up, lazy. The dragon prince laughed. And for the first time in 300 years, the crimson hall echoed with joy.